Back in the 80s, I bought this Zorki 4 rangefinder camera after a friend who had a Leica told me about the Zorkis being a poor man's equivalent. I used it a few times and really liked the look and feel, but kind of drifted back into my comfort zone using SLRs. Skip forward to a few years ago and I kind of fancied a rangefinder camera to use for a bit of street photography. Obviously I could have used my Zorki, which needs a bit of a service now, but nothing I can't tackle. But you know how it is with gear acquisition syndrome, or GAS. I was drawn towards one of the Kiev rangefinder cameras, which from what I'd heard were better than the Zorkis, and they are definitely pretty to look at. For a brief history, the Kiev cameras started out as an exact copy of the Contax camera, which was made by Zeiss in Germany. Apparently, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union took much of the tooling and spares, and even some of the engineers, from the German factory and set up production in Kiev, and thusly the Kiev camera was born. Over the years the camera was developed, and depending on who you listen to, production quality might have slipped a little over that time. So I ended up getting this 1975 Kiev 4, or at least I think this is the Kiev 4. It's kind of difficult to tell the model number when they don't stamp it anywhere on the camera. The Kievs often came with a Jupiter 8M lens attached. I did a video a few years ago when I tried one of these lenses on a digital camera, link in the description, so I was quite happy to have one of these on the camera that I bought. It's a 50mm f2 lens with the aperture ring on the front and no focusing helicoid. The focusing is bizarrely part of the camera mount on the Kiev. To release the lens from the camera, you hold down this little spring, rotate the lens clockwise and off it comes. To reinstall the lens, line up the tab with the red mark on the mount, rotate the lens anti-clockwise until it clicks into the locking ring again. With the lens at infinity as it is now, you can't move the focusing until you pull this pin, at which point you can now focus the lens, but as soon as you return to infinity it latches again. Additionally, you can release the infinity lock by pressing this button on the top of the camera and focus using the knurled wheel in front of it. Or you can use a combined approach, releasing the lock ring with the button on top of the camera and rotating the lens with your other hand, which feels more natural to me. That leads us on to probably the quirkiest quirk of the Kiev camera. A fairly normal way to hold the camera might be something like this. But over here is the viewfinder window, and the other window that my finger is now covering is the window for the rangefinder patch, so I can't focus holding it like this. If I drop my finger lower so the rangefinder window isn't obscured, I now can't get that finger easily up to the infinity lock button when it latches in place. Many people adopt the Contax grip, whereby one finger is used for the shutter release, another for the focus lock button and wheel, and the remaining fingers curl out of the way at the bottom of the camera. But that feels really unnatural to me, so I think I mostly end up gripping the camera like this, and using my shutter button finger to release the focus lock while doing the focusing with the other hand. Staying with the lens and focusing, not all of the lenses for this camera used the internal bayonet and focusing helicoid. Take this 135mm Jupiter 11 for instance. This has its own focusing helicoid and a drive coupling to rotate the helicoid on the camera, otherwise the rangefinder wouldn't work. The Jupiter 11 uses the external bayonet and fits snugly over the inner mount by lining up the tiny red dots and rotating the lens anti-clockwise until it clicks into position. It also has to slide past the infinity lock pin, which it pushes out of the way, so at least with this lens you don't have to keep releasing the lock every time you get to infinity. As with most rangefinder cameras, the viewfinder now doesn't show you the correct field of view, so you'd either guess, or use a clip-on turret viewfinder, which would show you more or less what you'd actually be taking. I plan to use a clip-on viewfinder from a different camera. It doesn't have exactly the right frame lines, but if I just work slightly inside the tele markings, it's about right. Also on the front is the self-timer lever. Advance the film, rotate the self-timer lever, and move the button in the direction of the arrow to start the countdown. The shot will be taken about 10 seconds later, giving you just enough time to run round and get yourself into the shot. There's a flash sync socket over here, and on this model there's a selenium cell for the light meter behind this flip-up panel. My meter works, but it underreads by a stop or so. On the top of the camera is the film rewind knob, which pulls out, making it a little easier to use. Around that, only on models with the exposure meter, is the film speed dial with measurements in GOST, which, if I remember correctly, isn't too far away from ISO. It might be about 10% less or something like that, but I have to set mine to about double the ISO I'm using to get it to read about right. To use the exposure meter, flip up the cover over the cell, point the camera at your subject, and rotate the outer dial until the needle lines up with the diamond, and read off the exposure. In this case I want to shoot at 1/50th of a second, and that lines up with f11, so that should be the correct exposure to use. Obviously I could use any of the other settings indicated, such as 125th of a second at f8, and so on. There are also markings on the exposure meter for low light conditions. If the needle won't reach the diamond no matter how far you rotate the outer ring, then you can rotate the ring until the needle lines up with either the 2 times or 4 times mark. Let's say we get a reading of 1/50th of a second at f5.6 with the needle pointing to the 2 times mark. Then we need to double our exposure, so that would either be 1/25th of a second at f5.6 or 1/50th of a second at f4. There is an adjusting screw on the back of the camera that physically moves the markings, allowing you to calibrate the meter. I've already got mine adjusted as far as it will go to try and get a reasonably good reading. There's a cold shoe for mounting a flash or external viewfinder, and a frame counter which you reset to 0 once you've installed and advanced your new film. That leaves us with the film advance, shutter speed and shutter button, which are all mounted concentrically on the right hand side. To advance the film, just rotate the upper ring clockwise until it stops. Then lift up the ring and rotate it until the black dot in this flattened section lines up with the desired shutter speed. Let the ring go back down in that position and then press the shutter button to take the shot. You can change the shutter speed before advancing the film, but it's all too easy to begin winding the film at the same time, and then you won't get the ring set in the right place, so I generally advance the film first. Shutter speeds range from an incredibly optimistic 1/1250th of a second down to half a second, and of course bulb. If you're doing long exposures, you can lock the shutter open by rotating the button anti-clockwise when you press it down, obviously with the camera in the bulb mode. Rotating the button clockwise so the 2 dots line up again will close the shutter. The shutter speed markings are pretty tiny and difficult to see in low light, but once you're used to the camera you can set it by feel. There's a biggish gap between 1/50th and 1/25th of a second, then 1/10th comes along pretty soon, then a huge gap before 1/5th, 1/2 and bulb. The Viewfinder eyepiece is pretty small, but it works okay. The Rangefinder is neither the best nor the worst that I've used, and as with other rangefinders, you rotate the focusing until the ghost image in the rangefinder patch lines up with the main image and you should be good to go. Or at least that's the theory. The rangefinder on my camera lines up when the focus is slightly in front of the subject. On most rangefinder cameras like the Canonet, this is easy to adjust accurately using the adjusting screws, but the adjustment on the Kiev appears to be utterly rubbish. You have to slacken a screw that allows the rangefinder mirror to move, try to get the mirror to the correct position, then as soon as you do the screw up again, the 2 plates slide and the mirror is out of alignment again. I've wasted a lot of time on this trying to get it correct, and it still isn't perfect. I might have another go one day, or I might just use faster films so I can use a smaller aperture, which will give me a bit more latitude when focusing. On the bottom of the camera is the rewind release button, which you hold down while rewinding the film, and the 2 knobs to remove the back. Flip up the two rings and rotate both knobs to free off the back cover. The cover should then pull slightly downwards before lifting away from the rest of the camera. Loading a film is much the same as on any 35mm camera, which I've covered in other videos, so I'll skip that for this time round and move on to looking at some of the shots taken using the Kiev. In general, the shots on this film are okay, but there are a few things I want to address before using the camera again. I've actually shot another film already, so that one will probably be much like this one. The Jupiter 8M lens isn't that sharp for landscapes or when shooting wide open. I often shoot landscapes using the hyperfocal scale to maximise the available depth of field. This should give me critical focus at the set distance and acceptable focus all the way to infinity, but it's pretty soft compared to some of my other old lenses. I have two copies of the Jupiter 8M and they both perform the same, so it isn't just a rogue lens. I do have other old lenses that seem to produce great results when married to the clinical sharpness of a digital camera, but then disappoint slightly when used on film. Grumbling aside, the shots do have a very vintage vibe going on, they just weren't exactly what I was expecting. Looking through the shots, there might be a little light leak on the camera somewhere. I initially thought it was lens flare, but it seems to be on too many shots. I added seals to the back as there were none when I got the camera, but the fit of the back, along with some of the other components, is appalling, so there could still be a gap somewhere that I haven't spotted. I think all the baffles in the rangefinder area are present. I've checked multiple times with the torch, but the whole camera isn't the best engineered thing I've ever come across. The noise of the shutter firing sounds a bit pathetic compared to the satisfying clunk of an SLR or the quiet click of a leaf shutter. At faster speeds it's okay, but at slower speeds it sounds and looks like it's struggling. But all the speeds, apart from the unrealistic 1/1250th of a second, are about right on the shutter timer, so I guess that's just how it is. Anyway, time for some more shots taken on the Kiev, and then I'll do a short summary. I had hoped that I'd like the Kiev more than I do. I still think it's a very pretty camera, but for me the Zorki is better engineered and possibly more satisfying to use as a result. Although I know the Industar 61 on my copy can also produce fairly soft shots given half a chance. It's another lens that works brilliantly for shooting video on a digital camera. I'll put a link in the description to a video I shot using the Industar 61. Hopefully I'll be a bit more enthusiastic when I get the second roll of film from the Kiev processed, but I'm not sure that it's going to become my go-to street photography camera. Anyway, that's about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.